This presentation came out of the Subcommittee on Environment that Commissioner Marasco is chairing. And she and I had a discussion basically agreeing that when a subcommittee is getting a presentation that's meaty and has an expert in, if it's a topic that we think will be of interest both to the public and to the full LPC board, LPC commission, that we should have that presentation occur at one of our meetings whenever possible. So I don't know whether you want to do more introduction, Amy?
Yeah, thank you. So the Environmental Subcommittee received a wonderful overview presentation by Commissioner Mosier about dark sky lighting, so that we had some orientation to what that could look like if we went forward to have an ordinance in Lewis. From that, we said that we really needed to have someone who was a technical expert who had worked with cities. So I contacted an engineer that I'd worked with in Virginia. I have never met Randy, except now I'm seeing him virtually. I've seen him before virtually. But he was highly recommended. He's in St. Louis, and he's generous of his time to just be with us this evening, put a presentation together for us. What the Environmental Subcommittee is looking at is how could we go forward with dark sky lighting? How could we go forward in retrofitting existing municipal, this is again municipal, or developments, commercial developments, but also to educate the public about the benefits and any of the cons. We also have Kate Singh, who's here present, who is our intern, who has some other references that she's given us as well. So we are maybe 30 minutes ahead of you as a group. The most of us are right here, because Melanie gave us a great overview. But thank you, Randy, for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to you. He's going to give us a presentation for about 20-some minutes and then open it Q&A, because we wanted to get kind of at the core. What I will say is that Randy has worked directly with cities, directly working with retrofitting and putting in new. So he's very familiar with not only the technology and the public interest, but also the ordinance level. So Randy, I'm going to turn this over to you.
All right, thank you. First of all, sound check. How do I hear?
You sound great. Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for the invitation. This is a subject that I'm pretty passionate about, and I think a lot of lighting designers who work in this field would say the same thing. It's our skies are something we've I think I can safely say we've all lived with a long time in our lives. And they're a factor of our everyday lives, day and night, of course. We're going to spend most of the time on the night, and perhaps things we can control. A number of years ago, we started to hear oozing into the discourse of environmentalists was the impact of lighting on the nighttime sky. And I think today we all will agree that there is an impact on the nighttime sky through electric light, or some would call it artificial light. Light is light, but it's light that's generated from artificial or non-solar sources at night. And they do make an impact, and it differs on where you view it, where that impact occurs. I remember when I was growing up in central Pennsylvania, a small town, and I live in St. Louis now. I have a practice here, some 35 years in architectural lighting design. But in the summers, we'd go west and we'd camp in the mountains in New Mexico and Colorado and other places in the Rockies. And one of the highlights for me every year, it was typically 6 to 8 day camping exercises, a lot of hiking, was the night, and an unspoiled night, and being able to see not just hundreds or thousands of stars, but millions of stars, the Milky Way. And I remember that being it's something that's seared into my memory, I should say, as being just an incredible sight and to experience it. And you remember it, and when we go back to where I lived, I couldn't wait to see it again. Today, my guess is that it's a very small number of folks who get to see that now without traveling to a place like that. Even when I was growing up in Pennsylvania, as I mentioned, I could go out in a field in rural Pennsylvania and easily see the Milky Way, shooting stars, as they would call a falling meteor. Well, unfortunately, we've put a lot more visible light into our sky since then. So what I'm going to talk about today is looking at the impact of light, not just in our skies, but in our environment, in our built environment, and in what we witness every night, even if we're not looking up. And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and take command here of sharing the screen. Host disabled, participant sharing. Thank you. And let me see if I can. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, so as pointed out, I'm going to try to keep this prepared material to about 20 minutes or so, and I'll have plenty of time afterwards. Keep me all night if you want to talk about this. So when we talk about responsible nighttime lighting, which we practice, we feel, we being the lighting design community, responsibilities go far beyond just a single light source or a single area or entity. We look at light and how it impacts others, how it impacts the environment, other creatures of the night, the skies, and so forth. But what I thought I'd do is kind of step through what we know about light and its impact and talk a little bit about measures that we may take and some measures to mitigate problems with light at night, and also to take a look at the model lighting ordinance, which was birthed by the Illuminating Engineering Society and the International Dark Sky Association a number of years ago, back in 2011. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight, a little bit about community awareness and what you can do to make your skies in the immediate surround more friendlier, and to make them more compatible with the lifestyles that you wish to live, whether it's in your community or any community for that matter. I'm sure these next few slides, you've seen these images or images like these before. And this is a shot from a satellite. This is one of the older photographs of concentration of light. And not surprisingly, it's mostly in America's cities. And you can see them there. And I'm sure if I ask you all to point to these blobs and give me the city, most of you would do a good job. And again, conversely, if you look at the really dark areas, you've hopefully been to some of those as well. And of course, we're not the only ones who have light from our surface, the surface of Earth, returned to the sky, either through reflection or direct contribution from light sources. Here's Europe, a little different color temperature there for the white, but nonetheless, you can see, you all know Europe is a fairly compact continent considering its population. China, you can see Japan and Korea here as well, and find it interesting when you look at the Japan, which is a fairly small island, and the big picture of things, and how intensely bright it is everywhere. And China, most of the major cities along the coast, but certainly inland cities that are also quite large. You can see part of India also in this satellite photograph. Contrast that to Mongolia, which you see here just in the north of China. Very little are man-made light or electric light. The only concentration of light at all is right here at Ulaanbaatar, which is their capital city. And even if you take a satellite view closer to just a singular location, in this case New York City, once again you can define the city without knowing where it is, simply by understanding it's all lit, and in a sense it's almost a corpuscular look of the city and light and how it pulses through the environment. Any light we're seeing here, I won't say that it's wasted per se, but if you're viewing it in this slide, in this image, it has made its way from either a reflection or a direct source into the sky and past the obstacles, and now it enters the atmosphere. And unlike pollution, you hear this called light pollution, unlike the sort of classical pollution, it isn't the kind of light, for the most part, that lingers. If there was a blackout in New York, and there's been a number over the years, this would look very different at night with very few lights visible. So what I want to talk about, as I mentioned earlier, is the impact of light, but also I think the underlying message is how can we preserve our sky? And I'll talk more globally than singularly to, say, Lewis or a community like yours, although I do have a few images here I want to share with you. I won't read these to you. You can read these bullet points. You can see what sort of the things I want to talk about. As a lighting designer, we use light in the outdoor environment, and certainly for safety, I don't want to fall down. Security, I don't want to feel afraid to go into certain areas of cities or wherever. I do want to see a visual environment that is some way enhanced through light, hopefully in a manner that is responsible and eliminates some of the more difficult circumstances when it is turned on at night and enters the night sky. I think the things that you saw in the previous slide were ones that it would come to your attention quickly. Some of these we now have terms for them when we discuss them with clients, sometimes cities, and as you pointed out earlier, we've done quite a bit of ordinance writing and master planning for cities, both small and major cities. Here, we're going to really focus on a couple of things that I think are important to quality of life, as well as quality of life, not only human, but critters and other inhabitants of the earth. Light trespass, annoyance, nuisance glare, sky glow, which is what we really started with tonight, and one that's becoming increasingly difficult, habitat disruption. And we'll just talk about these a little bit as this introduction moves on. So let me just define these a little more. When you hear me or others use the term sky glow or light pollution, I put that in quotes because it's oftentimes people associate with the word pollution with a permanent problem. And hopefully, as you know, if all the lights in a given area are turned off, they're no longer polluting the atmosphere. But they may have impact while they're operating, but when they're not operating, you don't, for the most part, you do not have a problem with visible light or even non-visible radiation from light fixtures, because that would not be going into the atmosphere. But basically, the brightening of the night sky due to man-made sources of light diminishes the ability to view the sky in an unobstructed manner. So you're not squinting, you're not having to shield your eyes, you're not having to drive somewhere else to try to see things. That's normally where we see sky glow, how we see sky glow represented in the technical jargon and technical appraisal. Light trespass is something that we segregate from the glow in the sky, or the light that's wasted goes into the sky. Light trespass is light off of a confined area. So if you look at this, spill light that gives rise to annoyance, discomfort, distraction, or a reduction in the ability to see essential information. Easy example of this: if you live nearby a sports field that has nighttime events, is there light leaving that site and, in a sense, trespassing onto your property or property where you're, the places that you're in which you're dwelling, and it's in some way eroding the quality of your area or your space because it's not being controlled and allowed to stay within the confines of the sports area, but it's actually spilling out into other areas. Sometimes it's just a minor annoyance. Other times it can be quite uncomfortable, and it's we frequently deal with situations where there are problems with sleep and other nighttime or nocturnal activities that are just really severely disrupted by spill light from railroad yards and sports fields and things like that. And then glare, which is the sort of third leg of the stool. Glare is probably the most difficult one sometimes to define, but is maybe the most important one to understand. Light that causes visual discomfort or disability or significant loss in visual performance. You can, I'd say one of my favorite examples of glare is if you're driving a rural area at night and it's late at night and there aren't that many cars on the road, and if you happen to be on a 2-lane highway and a car is coming your way after several minutes of no vehicles, it comes over the rise in front of you and just deadly glare. Your eye had adapted, what's called dark adapted, to a much darker ambient light, and then in front of you instantaneously appears very high intensity light, and your eye, you squint, you shield your eyes, all because of the glare. Your pupil is opened and there's that light scatters in your eye. It makes it very difficult to see. That's an extreme example. I think we all could identify with it and understand it. As it turns out, most glare that we receive or somehow makes its way into our daily lives is less noticeable than that. The glare might take place and you may not even know it because the glare contrast is not recognized outwardly for being glare, just that you can't see. We've all put on hats in order to shield our eyes from the sun. That's direct glare from the sun. We're not going to get rid of the sun, so we do things to mitigate the glare. But glare in the outdoor environment at night can be specifically very difficult because of the ambient conditions, which are normally blackness or darkness. So let's look at these a little bit closer so that we understand what they are. Sky glow, light pollution, is primarily light that either goes directly to the sky or is reflected off other surfaces. Normally, things such as buildings and ground plane, highways, other things that are perhaps horizontal areas that are illuminated, sidewalks and so forth. But if they're concrete or light colored, the light some of that light is absorbed by the concrete surface, but then the portion that isn't, it reflects into the sky. And it typically is, in the cities, you'll see much more of it. The understanding of glare for indirect, that's second direction, bounces around. There's also direct sources, light sources that put some of their light down, but also some of their light right into the sky. And unfortunately, those are the most difficult ones to mitigate because it's that high intensity, often high intensity goes right into the sky and then scatters depending on the kind of atmosphere that evening or that time of day. We do a lot of work with indigenous waterfowl and migratory bird populations and understanding their flight corridors. Even here in St. Louis, a number of years ago, we illuminated the arch. And it's still illuminated to this day, but it only is typically on 2 to 3 hours a night. And during the 2 peak bird migratory periods of the year, it's turned off the entire month. It's not that the direct glare from the light sources are harming the birds. It's just that the light will scatter at that altitude in the clouds and will disorient them. So even unintended consequences, you think you're doing a good job of lighting a surface. When the weather gets bad, it starts to fragment light beams and so forth. That scatter can really be harmful to the creatures. Of course, we're seeing light pollution creep into areas that up until recently really didn't have much impact. And the one you can see on the left in Mexico over at White Sands, I was just there a few weeks ago, and there's some light pollution that, especially when you have some clouds, that starts to creep into the White Sands National Monument Park. And you can see how it's starting to erode here in this photograph. It erodes some of the view. There are areas that are considered dark sky locations. This is Flagstaff on the left, which was certified by the IDA as a dark sky city, which we could talk about that later if you'd like. Basically, all the light goes down. There are curfews. There are wavelength restrictions, wavelengths of light. Some wavelengths of light scatter differently than full spectrum light. And so those sorts of things are ways that you can diminish the impact of nighttime lighting. And of course, when you're, I guess, fortunate you're in a place like this Indian reservation, Blackfeet tribe in Montana, where there just isn't much light. The only reason you're seeing these teepees or these dwellings are because of some artificial light. But you can see the skies are beautiful. I always like this graph. It was published a few years ago for the first time, and kind of defining what's a dark sky, as you see it to the far right, where you can see it has been estimated that someone in a fully dark adapted condition can see up to 2.5 to 3 million stars at one time, or more. And even those are the ones you can make out, and there's the very soft glow in the distance that are millions and millions more. Up to, you see at the far left there, if you live in a large city and you're somewhere within the urban fabric, you may not see any stars at all. I live in St. Louis, and we see roughly a little less than 1% of the brightest stars, or of the brightest things in the sky, mostly planets and some of the very large stars. Occasionally I see some other things, but on a typical night, that number 7 is pretty common for most cities of any size. I mentioned habitats. We're doing a lot more work with birds, I have to admit, bats. We're doing a project along the Mississippi River in Memphis right now, creating areas or lighting areas near the Mississippi River where bats make a home, and we're using wavelength control, using only short, longer wavelengths, yellowish, almost orange character light, which bats don't see in that part of the spectrum. So their nightly feeding is not disrupted. Most all of you, I'm sure, have heard of the turtles along primarily the Gulf Coast, some on the East Coast, turtles and hatchlings that will hatch, and they come out, and for millions of years, once they hatch, they made their way to the sea. And during a full moon over the ocean, the reflected light from the moon is a very cool color. I'll characterize it. Hopefully most of you experience that. And that's what's called short wavelength light. It's reflected off of the moon's surface, and the quality of the light that's reflected is short wavelength, and a bluish, if you will. So they would make their way toward the moon and be into the ocean. Well, unfortunately, with all the development in the coastal communities, a lot of those visual cues that have developed over millions of years of existence are now being triggered by artificial or electric light on shore that can outshine the moon every night. And if it's not shielded properly, instead of going that way from the sands into the water, they turn around and walk across the road, or try to. So many of them are killed every year, toward the blue habitat light across in the commercial developments. And this is just one example of, you see here a bird collision mapper, and different types of birds and how frequently they run into buildings and cities. Now, I'm a lighting designer, and light does not cause all these problems, but it does have an impact. Now, let me put these in maybe a little more tangible understandings. One of the things, glare, light trespass, and sky glow, you can wrap up into examining lighting equipment, because most of the glare, most of it, can be mitigated just by selecting the proper luminaire or lighting fixture, as you would call them. You can see these graphs here. If you go down to the right-hand corner, light sources are typically characterized as non-cutoff, meaning light goes everywhere. We've all seen lollipop lights, and light just goes everywhere. Semi-cutoff, where straight-up light is eliminated because it has an opaque hood on it or housing. Cutoff says we still have a housing, but we enlarge it and we put the light source within that housing, and then all the light is forced to 90 degrees or lower. And that keeps most of the direct light away from the sky. And then finally, you'll hear the term full cutoff, which not only does what the cutoff does, but also lowers that angle such that it helps eliminate or minimize glare for people in the environment. You can see some little bit of that described here. The light that you see in that little yellow triangle is really the most useful light at night. It's at an angle that is not all that disruptive visually, and you can walk in these environments without squinting or having to shield your eyes from glare. If we look over here on the right-hand part of the screen, you can see this is a light source, LED light source that has almost no, it's a semi-cutoff, has almost no glare control. So not only is it glary perhaps to whoever took this photograph at that position, but look at the light spill into this residential setting, this facade. My guess is we wouldn't want to be sleeping there. And it spills elsewhere, and as you might imagine, this happens again and again and again because there are hundreds of these sources in streets and cities around the country. Just some more examples of glare. The direct glare, as I mentioned, is probably the most difficult. It's the easiest to overcome, but it's also the most frequently encountered because it's cheaper to use, let's say, 5 or 6 poles, where if you used a full cutoff, you might have to use, and I'm just making this as an example of a parking lot. So let's say for every 6 or 8 poles you see here, you might really need to use 10 or 12 to get full cutoff. Still have good coverage, but you would shield all this glare and light scatter. Here's a pedestrian scale pole in a residential community, and it's standing in someone's front lawn looking at it. Obviously that light's not doing that person any good. Same with the other examples. And just some more. You've all seen these sorts of things, but recognize it for what they are. They're poorly controlled light sources. It can be controlled. All of this light can be controlled. Now, you can see here in the upper right-hand corner, bad night, kind of rainy, overcast. Some of that is scattering with the atmosphere, and it's very difficult to cut through that with anything other than a full cutoff luminaire. I was like, there's 2 photos here. This one and this next page, pairs of photos. This one shows a light source on the side of a building, someone's home, I think. And you can see there's a figure. If you look really close, there's a figure that's a shadowy figure in that entrance. And this is the light source you see at the same time. This is a close-up of that person standing in the threshold. Now, if I shield that light source, something as simple as just putting up your hand and shielding it, the camera can show you what happens with the eye. The camera resets, of course, its setting, just like the eye would. So now, without the glare in the field of view, this person is more visible and hopefully more recognizable to someone if they're approaching you, maybe in a downtown street where you're not familiar with the surroundings. You want to be able to see this. Well, the more glare in your line of sight, the less chance you will of being able to identify people. I mentioned about there's a lot of cities around the country, around the world, who are changing out the old legacy sources, high pressure sodium, metal halide, and so forth, going to other ways to illuminate. And these are very glary light fixtures, and unfortunately a lot of the time they just put in these LED retrofit kits and it just spews light everywhere. A lot of pollution, glare in these higher zones we talked about. But you don't have to. Here's this is LED, you can see all the little dots there. Here's a version where the LEDs are in a horizontal pan, put into the same kind of, or similar types of luminaires. That light comes straight down like this, or at an angle that's very sympathetic for vision. And you don't get much spill light and almost no light upward. I mentioned coming in, I know we're in about a little over 20 minutes, another 5 minutes or so here, and we'll get to some questions. As I mentioned, the IES and the IDA, which are, you see their logos here, back in 2011, it issued the model lighting ordinance. Besides myself, there are a lot of people in IES and IDA who worked on this project and have now been updating it in recent years. So you're going to see a new one very soon. But the idea here was to create or help create guidelines. One of the most important things that this particular document and the effort produced was the creation of lighting zones. Lighting, there are 5 of them. You see LZ1 through LZ4. I'll tell you what you don't see here is LZ0, which is for truly dark sky environments, national parks, middle of the ocean, places where there really shouldn't be any light, or if there is some, it's the absolute minimum. We won't talk about those unless you want to in the question session, but these are the 4 most often used. Low ambient light, areas where light might adversely affect flora, fauna, or disturb character. But I won't read these all to you, but most cities, let's go to New York City, it would fall in an LZ4, very high ambient, a lot of the human activity and lighting levels of higher lighting levels are necessary for certain things in large cities that moderate size and smaller cities don't have. Moderately high ambient, moderate ambient. This is moderately high, moderate ambient. And not only are these talking about how much light, but also how it should be controlled, extinguished at certain times, cut back to 50% at certain times. There's much more detail into these zones. If you have, some of you may be familiar with them and know about those, and these are examples of where they would be used or could be used. Another thing they've done with the lighting zones is to introduce what kinds of areas would fall into these. Let's say I'm doing an outdoor sales lot, but is it in an first of all, it wouldn't be allowed in LZ0. But if you're doing an LZ1, you should only use 4 lumens per square foot. I'm not going to get into all these technical terms. I'd be more than happy to do it if somebody has a question, but you can see it goes up as you get. So if you have an outdoor sales lot for, say, vehicles, you're allowed to use a lot more light in those areas because the ambient light levels are much higher. Conversely, if you're a small business person and you're selling cars in a small town, you don't need that much light to draw attention. You can do it with a much less light and more responsibly. And you can see some of these others. These guidelines have been developed for many of the standard applications. You've also may have seen these definitions when we talk about light fixtures: fully shielded, partially shielded, and this was a luminaire with 97.5% of its flux from 0 to 10. This one's at least 90%, is a slightly less, it has the same name here, but one is an A and a B, has a slightly less stringent reaction. Here, only 2.5% of the light goes up. Here, as much as 10 can go up. All of this then can be translated to how good the glare control is, or how much light is going in an area that is makes to a sensitive environment. So as an example, to make it simpler, although it may not be simpler in appearance immediately, as many of you are lay people in this field, but they have 3 terms called backlight, uplight, and glare, and it's affectionately called bug rating. But each one talks about the important aspects of these light fixtures and what to, and they put depend on how well it controls backlight, uplight, or direct glare. The lower the number, the better control of that light by the light fixture. So here you might imagine these are going to get pretty bad numbers. The highest number is 4, or the worst case, the best number is 0, no noticeable glare. Something like this is going to have a great deal of not only glare, but also uplight and backlight, because if it's next to your home, trying to light the street in front of your house, if it has backlight, that's not going to help. It might do a nice job on the street, but it's also going to be kicking light into your home or your property, similar to that one we saw earlier. Fortunately, with LEDs, newer products now, especially for roadways and streets, they have designs where the light source is completely encapsulated and flat, or all concealed from direct view, except when you get into the close line of sight. And you don't have to get long distance glare from these kinds of luminaires. They don't work necessarily everywhere, but when you're trying to light a lot of surface area, like roadways, parking lots, and so forth, well-designed LED sources with the right color can do a very good job. And these are I'm not going to go through them, but guidelines about maximum allowable backlight in these different lighting zones that we just talked about. Same with the glare, G1 through G4. I did misspeak here. The backlight, it can go up as high as 5. And then allowable uplight. Once again, in a lighting zone 0, like Yosemite Park, you're not allowed any uplight, 0. Whereas these gradually go up as the basic lighting zone goes up. Just a couple of examples. I've always liked these fairly simple descriptions that are really more almost caricatures of light fixtures. But for years, this was what you'd find in front of people's homes. Just a lantern with a light bulb, if you will, in the very center. Well, that light might look charming, but light pollution from that direction, glare is from approaching directions, and some downward light that was useful. And things like this, and they're still sold all over the world. And these can be have sources of all these things. Another way you see these done, let me point out to you that the actual light source you can visually see. Here's a version that is just the same, except it has a secondary lens. So they put a lens here to help soften the glare from the light fixture. This is frosted, and this one is beaded a bit. But same thing here, we do still get light pollution and glare and trespass. However, in recent years, some of these sources are now available, or some of these luminaire types are available, where the source is concealed up here. Whether it's a bulb, old-fashioned bulb, or whether it's an LED source, as you see here, the source is not directly seen until you get very close to the luminaire. So what looks like a glowing glass or a softly lit but partially obstructed luminous surface, here's a light within here that illuminates a metal feature texture. These would be considered either full cutoff or partial cutoff, and they're good for glare control and being used in residential areas and things like that. You can see all of them here, different types. All of these could fit most of the low glare condition needs. IDA, International Dark Sky, you go on their website, you would see that they show these little cartoon sketches of luminaires, acceptable like that or unacceptable. These are the Darth Vaders of bad glare. You might recognize some of this. This is, I believe, your neighborhood. I have not been there, although it looks lovely to me. These are just a few of the things you'll find on your streets. And you can see here, I have not seen this at night, so I don't know how it performs, but this is an area, this is a fixture without proper optics. It'll cause glare. Now, there are fixtures similar to this that do have pretty good glare control. Same with this. If you look closely, you don't really see the source, so it's probably up here in the canopy, which is good. Here's the newfangled Cobra heads that you see them throughout America. They're flat lenses. Some of the buildings in town, some of them have what appear to be interesting luminaires. This one, couldn't quite tell, but might have a luminous lens on it that may or may not be too glary. Sometimes what everyone would like to see as decorative and probably feels just fine when you're sitting here might be a little more glare than you'd want in the community. Here are two side by side. This one, you see how it's aimed straight down, so the source is completely shielded. So if you drive by here at night, you probably get a nice scallop of warm light on the surface of the building and light spilling out onto the stoop. Here, this is a completely exposed lens. Now, if it's a very low a very low wattage, it may not be a glare problem. However, sometimes these, which have their lenses pointing straight out, can become too overwhelming and be bright and glary. This is over at the EOE building, and they've got, it's almost a lighting fixture showroom. You can see there's a cutoff shoebox, as we call them. Here's another cutoff. So those would do a pretty good job at night at eliminating glare. Here, on the other hand, these are tilted up and are aimed straight out. And if you're driving or walking into this area, that glare could be debilitating. What is good to to hear for the future is there's a lot of work being done in lighting fixtures, and because LEDs are so efficient, they're now being designed with what we call soft optics. In this case, it almost looks like a wafer of light. The light source is actually in the rim, and it illuminates through this diffusion element, which becomes a glowing element for, it still gives you cutoff, but gives you nice soft light. When you walk through areas that are lit with fixtures like these, it's just, many manufacturers have these now. You get good facial light. You're not squinting and shielding your eyes from view. And the last couple of slides are something that we get called in on all the time: signage. There's a lot of video graphics being done in signage now, and signage with just LED sources. And since LED sources are so bright and efficient, oftentimes they overpower the view. Maybe you see them 4 or 5 blocks away, or as you approach them, you're squinting, you can't see the surround. So we work with communities to help them with an ordinance for signage. Things like, well, you can't use direct view light fixture, direct view LED sources. They have to be shielded, either silhouetted or muted. Just another way you can manage some of the glare issues with graphics is to demand dimming for every signage element can have a dimmer integral into it. I say virtually every one, so that when it is installed finally and it's turned on, well, yeah, it looks great, but you know what? That's really bright. Take it down to 50% or 25% and still get the impact that the merchant wants if it's a retail, but not so much that it's going to overwhelm the community and people around it who are just trying to make their way through the community, and not having to drive through glare or light spill. And there are ways of doing that and understanding how to manage brightness. One thing we're asked about all the time is enforcement of lighting in communities, and I won't talk much about it now. If you have questions, I will. But it's sometimes it can get pretty onerous, and not to mention it could be controversial. But if with good site submittals and checking of things, new construction can be managed in both small communities and larger cities. We did a master plan for the city of San Antonio, they were having problems with glare and light trespass, and they have a lot of tourists there, and glare was inhibiting them going into some areas and so forth. So we were able to help them light a good practice of lighting management and master plan that they've started to roll out now in the last 3 years since it was completed. And my last slide is probably just a good one, if this is the only one I even showed tonight, sort of principles for responsible outdoor lighting. I'm just going to read the headline for each one. The first one: all light should have a clear purpose. Just don't turn it on and think, okay, there it is, it's lighting my sidewalk. Well, maybe only 20% of that is reaching your sidewalk. Where's the rest of the light going? And that rolls down to the next one. Targeted light should be directed only where it's needed. Don't put spill light or light where it's not needed. That's what starts to give us the problem with light trespass and other glare. Light should be no brighter than necessary. Maybe in Times Square, you need quite a bit more light if you drop your mobile phone than if you drop it in Yosemite, right? Even though the task is the same, you're looking for what you just dropped on the sidewalk or the ground. But you have to know what it is you're designing for, and that's what should be no brighter than necessary. Controlled light should be used only when it's useful. And what that means is the obvious: turn it off if it's not being used, or dim it. Most of our projects have lighting, outdoor projects have curfews, and the control automatically cuts back light levels at certain times of the day. And maybe motion sensors take over if there have to be people there longer. It will keep maybe the higher light levels, but once they leave, they'll go back down to a lower area. And then finally, where you can, use a warmer source. Now, you'll hear the term I would use, a warm source is a long wavelength, versus a short wavelength, which is the bluish end of the spectrum. Those can be more detrimental to the environment. and it can disrupt sleep and so forth. And that's rare in that particular byproduct. But warmer sources tend to be more comfortable on the eyes, less squinting. You don't get as difficult a light rendition, good color rendering, and frankly, most communities like the warmer glow source. All right, well, I've taken more time than you asked me to, but I wanted to get through this, and I'm still more than happy to take on some questions. And let me get out of this and
Great.
give you back the screen.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to open up the floor first to questions from our commissioners and panel here, and then we'll be opening up to the public. Any questions?
Good.
Randy, you mentioned the model ordinance that you shared, and you said that it was going to be updated soon. Do you have any anticipation of when that's going to happen?
A couple of my colleagues are on the committee, several committees that do this, different areas of the ordinance. They're shooting for sometime the middle of this decade, so I'm guessing 24, 25. I don't think it's going to be out this year,
Okay.
but they've made good progress for what it's worth.
And then my second question is, how would you approach, for Lewis, and we do have some of the preferred lighting, but not a lot. How would you start with a city? It's expensive to install new. How do you handle retrofitting? Just how do you begin? That's my question.
Yeah, unfortunately, very few times you get to walk into a new town or a new city and start from scratch. It just doesn't happen. Matter of fact, in commercial settings where you have car dealerships or other kinds of retail establishments, they may have a litany of bad lighting applications, and it's difficult to say, well, you've got to change all this. Frankly, you can't in most cases force them to change lighting because when it was installed, it was fine. Oftentimes there's a sundown, and after 5 years you need to do this and so forth. But when you go into a community that has, like most communities, they're going to have areas that have lighting issues because of poor fundamentals, and we typically would suggest starting with an education process and make them understand why bad lighting is bad lighting and why it's, in some cases, it can act counter to the reason it's out there. And most people are sympathetic to it, but there is almost always costs involved to replace. So retrofitting, there are some good retrofit kits. Now, not all light fixtures have good retrofit kits available, but many of them do. The one I like to pick on is the one I showed you earlier of the ubiquitous acorn light. I'm sure you've all seen acorn lights. As you come upon them, they're so bloody bright that you can't even see if there's anybody in the crosswalk. You can take that same light fixture, remove the guts, and put in an LED retrofit product with a full cutoff distribution. That pan I showed you in the one slide, and it would take, if the original luminaire was an F in glare, you could get it up to a B by just doing that, B as in boy. You'll still have a little light scattering in those acorns because the surfaces are faceted. You get light striates and so forth. But yeah, there are ways to do it in relatively low cost, and there are ways that are much more expensive or may have to be done in a more expensive way. We've done also we helped with a community guidelines for several small cities, to anywhere from 50 to 100,000 people, and good practice, lighting good practice, and they can go out into the community and look at where they can make changes and what the city can do and offer buybacks and things like that. So there's a lot of creative things coming up now for smaller, mid-sized communities.
Great.
Other questions from our commissioners?
I had a question. It was just, is this, can we somehow make this, I guess this is a question for Anne Marie, kind of. Is there a way to make this viewable by other committees in the city? I was thinking like Parks and Rec. This has just been a very quick and informative presentation.
I think it will be posted online, and so in that way it will be viewable. I mean, in a sense, we can also refer them to the recording, because seeing the slides alone, it's far more useful to hear the presentation along with those slides.
We could also, and Blue can nod her head if I'm right or if I'm wrong. We could also edit out the presentation and create a video specifically of that and place that on the website, and maybe encourage, the committees to look at it. And again, I think the Board of Public Works
Absolutely.
as well, because they purchase and install all of our street lighting. So that would be important as well.
I think that would be great, Anne Marie, because it's always a little bit difficult for people to go through to try to find a given topic in these recordings. So,
And then I just wanted to make a follow-up comment. This time putting Charlie on the hot seat, but I think that this, we really spent time looking at this when we were working on the subdivision rewrite. And are we totally up to the latest standards within the subdivision code, the new subdivision code, or
I wouldn't think so.
Well, I know
Because-
Tom West did a lot of work on the dark sky.
Yeah,
lighting
we
during
did, we
that.
did really
we did
address
do
it.
dark
We
sky
spent
work,
time on
yes.
it.
I'd have to go look through it to see if it meets,
It
some
was
of the
Tom,
requirements.
okay, I'm sorry, Charlie. I
Yeah,
thought
it's
it
okay.
was
No,
you.
I remember it, and he did a lot of good work on it.
He did.
Yeah, we'd have to go back and just compare it to what, some of the things Randy's been bringing up tonight.
I think it's worth revisiting, and this is a question to Mr. Burkett. You mentioned the rewriting, and that it'll be sometime this decade. I was hoping for a shorter time frame for that. But do you have any insight into what kinds of things would be updated or changed in it that might be helpful for us to know if we're looking at that document?
Well, that's a good question. It's a very good question. Oftentimes, changes in versions that are fairly nuanced. The 2011 was during the emergence of LED sources. So LEDs, first of all, weren't near as powerful then or pervasive as they are now. In fact, in our practice, we have a small practice, 10 of us, roughly 95% of the light sources we recommend as part of our design work are LED, or what we call solid state sources. So those are now, frankly, the only thing it's used in most applications. But with a rewrite coming, what you're going to find is they've been fine-tuning the lighting zones a bit more, also providing, I showed you that kind of odd-looking bug rating, backlight, uplighting, glare. We now know more about that than we did, I say we collectively as a discipline. We know more about that, and those are being retooled a bit. Now, will they massively change what's in the book right now, the MLO? No, it won't. I would say the MLO, about 89% of what's in there, if you would follow that alone, you would be way ahead of where most towns are now, those cities, small cities. It's that other 10, 20%, a lot more on habitat will be coming out. I think we all knew that we were in fact impacting turtles. We all know the turtle stories, but if you know bats and birds, and there's a lot of good research now coming online that can help along even rural highways. And some of those things aren't going to be implemented in cities, small cities. But yeah, I would say that what they have now is a solid, I would not toss it. I would keep it and perhaps be ready to implement a few other things regarding controls, which is the other big one that you don't hear as much about. But controls now, electronic controls, are so much easier to sense a light scatter, for example, foggy night. It can sense that with just one sensor on one pole and dim all the lights in the city, or in a way so they get less scatter and less impactful. So there are things that are going to be new that you won't have seen before.
One of the things that I think would be interesting, and I think it's where the environmental subcommittee, because we don't set policy, we really need some thinking beforehand before we do any kind of writing here. But it would be an interesting meeting, Anne Marie, to have city officials, BPW, Planning Commission, and just, it's like, let's get a baseline. The subdivision, ordinances, we're moving so positively in an environmental standpoint on all of the work you guys have done, obviously for several years. But when you come into Lewis, I came from, Randy, from a rural setting, and so when I first came into Lewis, I couldn't get over how bright downtown was, and still is. And so looking at where could we have impact first at the most cost-benefit way, where we obviously are setting ordinances and some direction for new subdivisions, but what do we do in a historic community? I had the fortune actually to be one of those communities in the last place I lived where we actually ripped out all lights, which were only 4 on a road, but we put in about 18 dark sky lighting. And the thing that was exciting about that is it modeled the behavior, and other towns are interested. So I think, Anne Marie, that's the one thing for Lewis is, what would it take? We're not writing ordinance. What would it take? What's the feasibility? How do we do it? Where do we go first? How do we retrofit existing that's cost effective? And let's have a vision that, 5 years from now, something reasonable. 5 years from now, we actually are a model city for dark sky lighting. We know our new subdivisions will be appropriately being built, but how do we go retrofit our historic district? And how do we do it and let our citizens know this isn't going to happen in a year? There's cost to it and planning, but something like that, to me, we've had some comments that have come in indirectly to the environmental subcommittee to members, where people are just saying, I'm frustrated. It's so bright. I understand that it's bright for safety, but aren't there other ways? So some kind of initiative like that, I think, would be, with those 3 parties, would be really helpful.
And I think it's interesting, if we have agreement on what we're moving towards, you make different decisions on the path there,
That's
whether
right.
it's as you're repairing things or making other other things that are happening along the way. Commissioner Evalds?
Yeah, I also think just public education, because we are a pretty dense community, and the lights that are on people's homes, including my own, are contributing to this. So that's kind of an easy fix, a much easier fix from a homeowner perspective.
Yeah. I'm putting a dimmer on one of my lights right now when I go home after your presentation.
Any other questions from our commissioners? Questions from other members of the panel here?
I was just wondering from Randy how it works creating lighting zones in a municipality. Talking about retrofits and subdivision codes, those are relatively easy to address, but I don't know how you create a lighting zone. I guess you just take a map, it would be easy enough to do, but is that even feasible for a city like Lewis?
That's a very good question. Typically, lighting zones, most urban areas start, unless they're in New York City or Washington, are the LZ3s that you recognize as a typical metropolitan area. When we tackled San Antonio a few years ago, San Antonio has a fair number of I'll call them, they're people who live in the city, but it's not a conventional single family dwelling, but they still would like darker environments. So it's not unusual to have if I thought about it, I would have put one up tonight, but larger cities, there may be a boundary line that is, we'll call it LZ, we'll say LZ2, which might be a small city or a large town. And then there are sections carved out where you might have a lower area because it becomes a bedroom community at that point. And there are always transition zones. It's so hard to transition. It's not like light becomes something different on this side of the street than over there. So you're never going to be able to, because I can stand on that side of the street and say see that side of the street, and that's an LZ2 and this is an LZ1. So it's not easy. It's from that standpoint. But you can do it by commercial districts. We have commercial districts. And I'll tell you where it really works if each of those areas are using good practices in the selection of their light sources, cutoff, low glare fixtures, and so forth, and that means that the major difference between, let's say, an LZ2 and an LZ1 or 3 and a 2 is the overall light levels, because there's a lot more people, there's the pedestrians crossing streets and so forth where we need more visible light. If all those light fixtures are well designed and they're not causing their own glare, they can easily cohabitate next to each other. So your community is not all that large, and I didn't look up the population, but I ran around your town via Google, and you should be able to strive for at least it would be an LZ2, but hopefully maybe even an LZ1 in some areas. But that's one of those things that the lower your light level, the more important it is that you do the things right, get rid of the glare. One glary light fixture in an LZ1 is going to look like a supernova, right? If it makes sense. And conversely, the other way around, if years ago, I remember a story from a colleague of mine who designed this really responsible, environmentally sound storefront for a retailer that had outdoor showroom space as well, and very little glare and low light levels, and no one could see it when they drove by because the other two establishments to either side had so much glary, bad lighting that it dwarfed what this person was trying to do. So it's important to get guidelines in place, and then hopefully over a course of time, certainly new construction, but maybe taking advantage of changes in neighborhoods and doing demonstration areas. You mentioned your house, and you can't wait to get home to change your porch light. Well, we found that the biggest problem with in residential areas are folks who want to put a light above their garage door, and then they aim it out into the street. I mean, how many of you got to have those in your community? And you're passing by and you're shielding your eyes. That can be done without impacting people coming by and without getting light trespass into other areas. I'm sorry, I'm running at the mouth here.
Any questions from the public? And I can't see, Blue, if there are any that have been written in online. Okay. Yes. Please identify yourself.
Yes.
We know you, but for the for our minute taker, we need.
Yeah, so I'm Kate Singh. I'm the intern that's doing research for the environmental subcommittee, and part of my research has been on this topic, so I really enjoyed the presentation. I think it filled in some gaps in my research that I was looking at, and I enjoyed hearing your take on the model ordinance, because that's also something that I looked at. And I remember when I was reading through it that I was looking at the language that you would use in an ordinance to kind of regulate dark sky lighting, and part of it was looking at the language of lighting fixtures. So when you're talking about semi-cutoff, cutoff, full cutoff, I think that IDA recommended you not use these terms in an ordinance because they're not specific enough to actually, talk about your lighting, because sometimes you can see like the placement of a light bulb in a light fixture completely change what classification it would fall into. So my question is kind of about what you would recommend. Do you think that it's necessary to use more specific language than that if you're thinking of writing that into code? I haven't actually found anywhere that has done that. Most of the places that I've looked at, cities across the country, have just used the semi-cutoff, full cutoff language. But I was wondering your take on it, if you think it's necessary to be more specific.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Yeah, that is a relic from previous glare discussions, frankly, before even LEDs came into being. Now the sort of level has really gone up because there's so much light coming out of such a small source, and the old definitions just don't really fit very well with the new ones, and that is one of the things they're changing in MLO. Instead of using semi-cutoff, cutoff, etc., which are large area sources and work pretty well, these small sources are now going to be more candle power at certain angles, and that's how it will be determined. Thresholds that are tolerable at different angles And so the human eye, as you're walking down the street, you have, of course, you have your, most people have, who are sighted, have an angle at which once you pass through it, the angle becomes steep enough that the glare is less and less of a problem. So if I was standing looking at you now and there was a light fixture just in front of me and over my head, but really bright, wouldn't be as bad for me as if the same light fixture was 20 feet ahead. So the intensity of these LED sources now has almost completely obliterated the old style of cutoff and semi-cutoff. It's the new standards you're going to see are intensity values. I'm on the glare committee of the IES, and we're looking at specifics to glare, which is far more difficult to measure. So I think what you'll see in the MLO is intensities, and those can be those can be produced by manufacturers of light fixtures, and you'll be able to say, hey, this has more than 2,000 candelas at 25 degrees. That's too much for us. We need 1,000 or less. I'm glad to hear you're interested in the lighting aspect of these environmental issues there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's what I was wondering. I was kind of stuck between, do we want to be more specific and make sure that we tackle every scenario, but do we want to make sure we're specific enough but not too specific that the public don't understand what we're talking about? So
that's a very good point.
I wanted to see if you had any opinion about the balance there.
Yeah. You can't start talking to the average person in the street about candle power and luminance and height and light intensity and so forth. So the stand-ins for that will be different in the MLO. There will be a highly technical way to calculate it, but there'll be better ways to define them anecdotally. So they're both going to be available.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, that's great. Great
Well,
questions.
I want to thank Mr. Burkett for the presentation. I was going to say you shed a lot of light on the topic, but I won't
It
go
looks
for
like,
the.
the city
for
manager,
the-
Anne Marie, has her hand up. Sorry
Oh,
to interrupt.
Anne Marie has her hand up. Sorry. Go ahead, Anne Marie.
One of the things that I've struggled with, and I've been dealing with ordinance implementation and enforcement throughout my career in smaller communities, is when these things are very highly technical, where I'm going to be honest, where it's over the heads a bit of those of us who are going to be in the position of implementation and enforcement. You know, we can make sure that the plans are done, that they have a lighting engineer, or that they're done by the proper professionals, and that they should. But we don't necessarily have a way to evaluate it in the field. We don't have that expertise. How do smaller communities address that issue?
Oh, it's an excellent question. Yeah, unfortunately, especially when it comes to glare, you and I could probably walk out somewhere and look at a light fixture together, and we could both agree that it's glary. But at what point does it not become not so bad? And those thresholds, if they're to be repeatable and you should have confidence in them, it will be a measurement or a calculation that allows that to happen. Now, right now, I believe most communities, and yours is probably the same, you might ask someone who's building a new location that includes site lighting, and they have to do a lighting calculation of how much light is on the site in the parking areas and so forth, as well as perhaps a boundary calculation of how many foot candles are being delivered to that boundary edge, and it can't go above a certain. Those are pretty well understood, and there are now ways that these light fixtures can be given ratings and numeric ratings. That bug rating was the forerunners of these ratings, backlight, uplight, and glare. And right now we're working on a major project along a river where we need to have a bug rating of 110. So that meant only 1 for backlight, 1 for uplight, and no glare because the pathways are very difficult and kind of rugged to get through. So the bug ratings are pretty good actually, and we use them now as a substitute for the more technical things that are now available, many of them, and they're coming down the pike, and you'll be able to do the kinds of calculations If you have to go out and measure them though, unfortunately, there's not much advice we can give you unless you know an engineer who knows how to measure those things in the field to verify that some particular intensity is too great or how much light's escaping above 90 degrees. It's really, it's difficult to police that.
But I guess if we require, for instance, that they provide their specifications, if it's large enough that we're doing detailed plan review, we could require that, you know, when they have their fixtures, that they submit their specifications so that we can determine that it meets that.
Yes, if I took a light fixture and it has a certain characteristic of the way the light is distributed straight down, we know how it behaves, we know what it'll look like to you as you're walking upon it. But if I take that light fixture and, you know what, I need more light out there, and I do this, it becomes something different, right? You don't have the light that's been disciplined in the proper angles. It's now being aimed across the street or aimed further out away from your house to get more coverage. Those kinds of things are misuse of what could be a very good piece of equipment. So there are ways of developing guidelines for that, how you should do it. But you'll still have situations. We have 3 communities in the St. Louis area who have us on, not retainer, but they call us up and say, Randy, we got a dispute out here. Can you make it next week? And Jane Doe and John Smith, and they're screaming at each other about their backyard tennis courts. And so we go out and we look at the situation, and we become Solomon, and we decree what's going to happen. But hopefully you don't have to get it. I think most of the time, if you can have a reasonable ordinance that specifies the kinds of equipment and gives you the guidelines that are solid enough that, yeah, there'll be a few things that'll squeeze through that you'll have to get to deal with. But for the most part, I think you can have a community that's quite well versed in environmental friendliness through light.
Great. Any other questions, Anne Marie? Thank you. Well,
Just before we hang up, I was just going to say, if you would like, I know this is a lot to absorb. I'd be more than happy to come back at some point if you want to do like a quiz show and talk more about it. Because oftentimes there's so much information at once, and I like talking about this stuff and see more and more communities get up to speed.
We now have your contact information, and we will not hesitate to reach out. I can guarantee that. So thank you again, and thank you to Commissioner Marasco for arranging this, and to Commissioner Moser for beginning the discussion. So thank you all.
Excellent. All right, I'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.